He fell in love with her through letters she wrote for someone else. She had penned 1,000 love stories but never believed she deserved her own.
Subscribe to Wild Sky Stories' new emotional tales every day.
The stagecoach pulled into Cedar Falls on a Thursday afternoon, when the sky hung low with autumn clouds. Thomas Reed stepped down onto the dusty main street, holding a worn leather satchel against his chest like it contained something precious. Because it did. Inside were 37 letters, each one written in the same delicate handwriting, each one addressed to his best friend Benjamin Cole, who would never read another word again. Thomas had been riding alongside Benjamin when the river crossing went wrong. The current had been stronger than expected, and Benjamin's horse had stumbled. Thomas had tried to reach him, had stretched his hand out until his shoulder burned with the effort, but the water had been too fast, and Benjamin had slipped beneath the surface with one final look of peace on his face. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now Thomas stood in a town he had never seen, looking for a woman he had never met, to deliver news that would break hearts. The letter in Benjamin's pocket had survived the river somehow, pressed against his chest in an oilskin pouch. Thomas had read the return address through blurred eyes. Margaret Sullivan, Cedar Falls, Arizona Territory. Benjamin had talked about the letters constantly during their months working the cattle drive together. He would read them aloud by the campfire, his voice softening over certain passages. "Your mother tells me you should eat more, Benjamin, and stop gambling your wages. But I think she forgets what it means to be young and full of life. I hope you are living, truly living, out there under all those stars." Thomas had loved those letters. He had loved the voice behind them, the gentle humor, the unexpected depth. Benjamin would laugh and say his mother had finally learned to write well in her old age. But Thomas had known. He had known that no elderly woman wrote with such poetry, such tenderness. Someone else was writing those letters, and whoever she was, she had the most beautiful soul Thomas had ever encountered. Now he walked down the main street of Cedar Falls, asking directions to the Sullivan residence. A shopkeeper pointed him toward a small house at the edge of town, where smoke rose from the chimney and curtains fluttered in the windows. Thomas removed his hat as he approached the porch. His hands trembled slightly as he knocked. The door opened, and a woman in her 60s stood before him, her hair gray at the temples, her eyes kind but curious. "Mrs. Cole?" he asked. She shook her head. "I am Ruth Sullivan. You must be looking for Emma Cole. She lives 2 doors down." Thomas nodded, but before he could turn away, another voice came from inside the house. "Mama, who is at the door?" A younger woman appeared behind Ruth Sullivan, wiping her hands on her apron. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped men in the streets. Her features were plain, her brown hair pulled back simply, her dress practical and unadorned. But when she looked at Thomas, he saw something flicker in her eyes, something intelligent and warm and impossibly familiar. "I am looking for Margaret Sullivan," Thomas said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "About some letters." The young woman's face changed. Her cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her hands. "I am Margaret," she said quietly, "though most people call me Maggie." Thomas stared at her, and for a moment he could not speak. This was her. This was the woman who had written those words that Benjamin read aloud, the words that Thomas had memorized without meaning to, the words that had made him believe there was still goodness and beauty in a world full of dust and hard labor. "I need to speak with you," Thomas said, "about Benjamin Cole." Maggie's mother stepped aside, and Thomas entered the small parlor. He sat in a chair near the window, still holding the satchel, still unsure how to begin. Maggie sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes never leaving his face. "Something has happened," she said. It was not a question. Thomas nodded. 3 weeks ago we were crossing the Miller River. The current took him. I tried to reach him, but I could not. The silence that followed was heavy as stone. Maggie closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they glistened with unshed tears. But she did not weep. She simply sat there, absorbing the pain with a quiet strength that made Thomas's chest ache. "I only met him once," she said finally. When he was leaving for the cattle drive, his mother cannot write and Benjamin could not read well enough to write back, so I offered to help. Thomas pulled the satchel onto his lap and opened it carefully. I have all the letters you wrote to him. He kept every single one. He read them aloud by the campfire, and the other men would gather around to listen. Your words meant everything to him. Maggie shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. I only wrote what his mother wanted to say. Thomas leaned forward. No. I heard those letters, Miss Sullivan. I heard every word. And I know that what you wrote came from your own heart. His mother may have given you the facts. But the soul of those letters, that was you. Maggie looked at him then, really looked at him, and Thomas saw something break open in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. You remembered them, she whispered. Every word. Thomas said. They sat in silence for a long moment, and something shifted between them, something neither of them could name. Thomas stayed in Cedar Falls that night, renting a room at the boarding house. He told himself he needed to rest before continuing his journey. He told himself he would leave in the morning, but the morning came, and he did not leave. He found work at the livery stable, brushing down horses and repairing harnesses. When people asked why he was staying, he said he needed to earn money for the next leg of his journey. But every afternoon, he found himself walking past the Sullivan house. And every afternoon, Maggie happened to be on the porch, reading or sewing or simply watching the clouds drift overhead. They began to talk. At first, their conversations were about Benjamin. Thomas shared stories from the cattle drive, moments of laughter and camaraderie that made Maggie smile through her grief for the boy she had barely known. But gradually, their conversations shifted. Thomas learned that Maggie had been writing letters for the townspeople since she was 15 years old. She wrote for elderly widows who could not see well enough to form the words. She wrote for young men too embarrassed to admit they had never learned. She wrote for lovers too shy to speak their hearts directly. I have written 1,000 love letters, Maggie said one evening, her voice carrying a note of something wistful. I have put words to feelings I have never experienced myself. Thomas frowned at this. You have never been in love? Maggie shook her head, and her smile was tinged with sadness. Who would love a woman like me? I am plain. I am quiet. I spend my days putting other people's words on paper. Men want beauty and grace. They want women who light up a room. Thomas felt something hot rise in his chest, something close to anger, but softer, more protective. You are wrong, he said firmly. You are so wrong. Maggie looked away, and Thomas could see that she did not believe him. Over the following weeks, Thomas found small ways to show her why. He could not quite say, he brought her wildflowers from the meadow, pressing them into her hands, without explanation. He fixed the broken step on her porch before she even noticed it was dangerous. He found a book of poetry in the general store and left it on her windowsill, with no note, trusting that she would know. The townspeople began to notice. They whispered about the drifter who seemed to have forgotten how to drift. They watched him watch her, and they smiled behind their hands. But Maggie still did not see. Or perhaps she was afraid to see. One evening, Thomas found her sitting by the creek at the edge of town, her feet bare in the cold water, her face turned toward the setting sun. He sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. I received a letter today, Maggie said quietly. From my cousin in Santa Fe. She writes that there is a man there, a banker, who is looking for a wife. He is willing to consider me if I travel there to meet him. Thomas felt his heart stop. Are you going to go? Maggie pulled her feet from the water and wrapped her arms around her knees. I am 28 years old, Thomas. I have no prospects here. My mother worries about what will become of me when she is gone. This banker may be my only chance at a family, at a home of my own. Thomas turned to face her, and without thinking, he reached out and took her hand. Do you want to marry this banker? Maggie looked down at their joined hands, and Thomas saw tears gathering in her eyes. I do not know what I want, she whispered. I have spent so long writing about love for others that I forgot to hope for it myself. Thomas lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles, gentle and reverent. "Then let me remind you," he said. Maggie's breath caught, and when she looked at him, Thomas saw the walls around her heart begin to crumble. Hi, she asked, her voice breaking. "Why do you look at me like that? Like I am something precious?" Thomas shook his head, unable to find the right words. He was not a man of letters. He could not write poetry or craft phrases that would live forever on the page, but he could speak his truth, plain and simple. "Because you are," he said. "Because I fell in love with you before I ever saw your face. I fell in love with your words, with the way you made a lonely man feel like he mattered. I fell in love with the kindness you showed to strangers, the beauty you put into letters you thought no one would remember. And when I finally met you, when I saw the woman behind those words, I loved you even more." Maggie's tears spilled over, trailing down her cheeks. "You cannot mean that." "I have never meant anything more." They sat there by the creek as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Maggie leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "I am afraid," she admitted. "I have watched so many love stories from the outside. I have written their beginnings and their endings, but I do not know how to live one myself." Thomas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Then we will figure it out together." The days that followed were filled with small moments of discovery. Thomas learned that Maggie sang while she washed dishes, old hymns in a voice that was slightly off-key but full of feeling. Maggie learned that Thomas talked to horses like they were old friends, sharing secrets he would never speak aloud to humans. They took walks through the autumn leaves, their fingers intertwined. They sat on her porch in the evenings watching the stars appear one by one. They talked about their pasts, their fears, their hopes for a future neither of them had dared to imagine. And slowly, Maggie began to believe. She began to see herself through Thomas's eyes, and she discovered something remarkable. She was not plain. She was not ordinary. She was a woman who had spent her whole life giving voice to other people's hearts, and in doing so she had developed a depth of understanding, a well of compassion, that made her extraordinary. One morning, Maggie sat at her desk with a blank piece of paper before her. For the first time in her life, she was going to write a letter for herself. "Dear Thomas," she began, "I have written 1,000 letters in my life, but I have never written one that mattered as much as this. I want to tell you that I love you. I love the way you see me, not as I am, but as I could be. I love the way you listen, really listen, when I speak. I love the patience in your hands and the kindness in your eyes, and the quiet strength of your heart. I spent so many years believing I was invisible. You have made me feel seen. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know if we will have years together, or only months, or merely these few precious weeks. But I know that whatever time we have, I want to spend it with you. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for staying. All my love, always, Maggie." She folded the letter carefully and walked to the livery stable where Thomas was working. She pressed it into his hands without a word, then turned and walked away, her heart pounding. That evening, Thomas appeared at her door with the letter in his hand and tears in his eyes. He did not speak. He simply pulled her into his arms and held her, and Maggie understood that this was his answer. This was his yes. The wedding took place 3 months later, on a crisp winter morning when frost sparkled on the ground and the sky was the color of new promises. The whole town gathered in the small church to watch the drifter and the letter writer exchange vows. Ruth Sullivan wept happy tears from the front pew. Emma Cole, Benjamin's mother, sat beside her, clutching a handkerchief and whispering prayers of gratitude. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas cupped Maggie's face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made the congregation sigh. That night, in the small house they would now share, Thomas found Maggie sitting at her desk, a pen in her hand. "What are you writing?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Maggie smiled and tilted her head back to look at him. I am starting a new letter. I thought I would write down our story from the very beginning, so that someday, when we are old and gray, we can read it together and remember. Thomas kissed her forehead. Make sure you include the part where I was too stubborn to leave town. Maggie laughed, and the sound filled the room like music. I will include everything, she promised, and she did. In the years that followed, Maggie continued to write letters for the people of Cedar Falls, but she also wrote letters for herself, for Thomas, for the children who eventually came to fill their home with laughter and chaos and joy. She wrote about the hard times and the happy times, the arguments and the reconciliations, the ordinary days that somehow became extraordinary simply because they shared them together. And when Thomas read those letters, he marveled at the woman he had married, the woman who had taught him that love was not just a feeling, but a practice, not just a moment, but a lifetime of moments strung together like pearls on a string. One evening, many years later, Thomas found Maggie on the porch, watching the sunset as she had on that first evening by the creek. He sat down beside her and took her hand. Do you remember? He asked. When you told me that you had written 1,000 love letters but never experienced love yourself. Maggie smiled, and her eyes crinkled at the corners with age and wisdom. I remember. Thomas squeezed her hand. How many love letters have you written since then? Maggie thought for a moment, then laughed. At least 1,000 more. Thomas nodded. And how many of them were from me? Maggie turned to look at him, and in her eyes, Thomas saw the same woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. The woman who had taught him that words were not just marks on a page, but bridges between souls. Every single one, she said. And Thomas knew it was true.